Capitalism and white supremacy. Two go hand in hand. You know, they're like they're like husband and wife. I'm not sure which one's the bitch. I think capitalism is the bitch, and white supremacy is the bastard, fucking it all the time. Huh. Want to talk about the mutual dependence of capitalism and white supremacy. This article talks about how it's one part of the. I'm gonna skip down parts of the article. The harshness of the government's response to the protests may, I'm quoting, may appear to be in contrast to its weak coronavirus response, but it is not. State and federal coronavirus responses have been characterized by government concern for profit over people, particularly people of color, who suffer disproportionately more severe illness and death from the virus. The current protests ensuing across the U.S. and the world, while stem from the case of George Floyd's murder, are a widespread response by the people to systemic racism throughout the police force and the criminal justice system. The reason the government's response to the protests was so swift and decisive is because the American system of capitalism has a vested interest in maintaining and perpetuating racism in its underpinning system, white supremacy. Indeed, capitalism and white supremacy are mutually dependent systems. The measures required to effectively fight coronavirus threaten the supply of workers needed for the American economy to continue to generate increasing profit margins for the ruling class. So these measures were not enacted. Black Lives Matter protests threatened America's racial and therefore economic order. So those thousands of National Guard members were called in to intimidate largely peaceful protesters. Over the course of the protests, far more harm has been done by police to protesters than has been done by protesters to the public. Thousands have been arrested, shot with rubber balls, tear gas, and pepper sprayed for the crime of peacefully protesting or for being outside at an hour which it was legal to be outside the day before. Meanwhile, the damage caused by the protests amount to mainly property damage, with few physical injuries inflicted by protesters reported. Efforts to fight coronavirus and to end systemic racism are both born out of a desire to save human lives. The government response to both crises is born out of a desire to protect business and the economic system as a whole at the expense of human life. The juxtaposition of these two events makes clear how little our masters care for the lives and the very humanity of the American people. Walsh stated, "Let's be very clear, the situation in Minneapolis is no longer in any way about the murder of George Floyd. It is about attacking civil society, instilling fear and disrupting our great cities." Walsh was correct that the situation is not only about the murder of George Floyd, but failed to deliver the proper context. He ignored the substance of the protests, which are in whole about dismantling the system of white supremacy in America that made deaths like George Floyd's possible. He instead demonized the protesters as attacking and instilling fear in other silver-reed white segments of society. Furthermore, a great city is not one that, like Minneapolis, perpetuates mass incarceration, invests in privatized prisons, and funds a militarized police department with taxpayer dollars. In this one statement, Walsh betrayed his fundamental loyalty and the loyalty of politicians like him around the country, and instead aligned himself with a militarized system of white supremacy. The chain of events that followed in terms of government reaction to the protests were extremely swift, especially in comparison to its muted response to the deadly and transmittable coronavirus, which health expert Dr. Anthony Fauci describes as his worst nightmare. In a period of 4 months, has devastated the world. Why I say mouse? In order for capitalism to function effectively, the ruling class needs to convince the vast majority of the population to serve as workers. These workers are integral to the system of capitalism, as they generate profit for the ruling class, or those who hold the means of production. If the ruling class can convince the workers to be happy with fewer and fewer resources, the ruling class can increase its own profit margin. Therefore, the ruling class must constantly work to convince the workers of their satisfaction with an ever-diminishing proportion of the results of their own labor. In America, workers are largely convinced to accept the terms of the ruling class for the idea that one day, with enough hard work, they too will ascend to the ranks of the ruling class. However, most people have a general awareness that wealth cannot be achieved for each person, as capitalism requires winners and losers in order to function. Certain workers must always be at the bottom, so each individual worker must be convinced that they are not in the bottom class. The American system achieves this perception for white workers and some workers of color by maintaining a permanent underclass of black Americans. If black Americans are always at the bottom of the economic system, then according to American capitalism, other workers are free to ascend the economic ladder. This ideology serves to divide the working class. Dividing white and black majorities is the time-worn tactic of the American elite, rooted in slavery as is American capitalism as a whole. During slavery, white plantation owners conscripted poor whites to serve as foremen, inciting them to inflict direct harm on black enslaved people and placing them in an economically superior position. By pitting black enslaved people and poor white people against each other, white plantation owners prevented the two disenfranchised groups from uniting in order to overthrow the plantation owning ruling class. This tactic continued past the end of slavery and into the present era, maintaining the fiction that poor and middle class white people are only an opportunity away from attaining wealth and power for themselves. Threatening the racial caste system in America threatens capitalism. As the protests currently sweeping the nation and in the world were to be successful, white supremacy would be seriously confronted for the first time in our nation's history. For the ruling class, this confrontation cannot happen if it's to survive. The reason the current people in power are the ones in power is due to the twin evils of white supremacy and capitalism. To erode white supremacy would mean the erosion of American capitalism itself. The two systems are mutually dependent, and we need to look no further than our own walls for confirmation. Got you, bitch. Got you, you pro-capitalist bastards. Got you, white supremacists. Bitches. No? Slade. No? You know? So yeah, white system needs for that to happen. The rich white folks, the ruling class, they need for that to happen. Yes, they'll allow a few non-white people in just so they can say they are inclusive. But they'll always try to pin the average wealth of black people lower than the average wealth of white people. You know? Black people's average household wealth is less than a tenth of that of white people's household wealth. Less than a tenth. You know? So, yeah. Capitalism and white supremacy are entwined with one another. So I want capitalism gone.